That was very different when we met. Dutch Game Garden era as well. Yeah, things move fast. Hi. As Ryder was saying, thank you so much for coming to a talk without a description. Really appreciate that. Every year I sort of get asked to do a talk and then sort of trusted with y'all's, with this stage and now with y'all's attention. Really appreciate that. Normally I give a lot of talks about business, marketing, creative direction, stuff like that. But to kind of do the introduction for those of you who could use it, my name is Rami Ismail. I'm an independent game developer. I used to work at a studio called Vlaambeer. I sold my part in that studio about half a year ago. I made a tool called Presskit, which is the industry standard Presskit structure nowadays. That was an accident. I was just lazy. I didn't want to make another one. I automated it, and then everybody wanted it. I run a conference called GameDev.world, which is an online conference that runs in 8 languages. You can give your talk in any of the 8 languages we support, and we will live translate it to all 7 other ones. Nowadays, I also run the Global Games Fund, but that's neither here nor there. I used to run a panel at GDC called Number One Reason to Be, where we flew people from all around the world to San Francisco to give talks about how game development works in their countries. I write a newsletter called Leveling the Playing Field, and I tweet too much. If you know me from Twitter, my apologies. Before any talk I give, I like to give a disclaimer. I think the disclaimer is important. Everybody who speaks on a stage like this might feel like they know more truth than they actually do, right? I'm on the stage, and I'm speaking as somebody who started game development in 2009-ish. I was an independent game developer. I came from the era where you would make Flash games to make $4,000, $5,000, $10,000. And then with that money, I made my first Steam games. iOS didn't exist, or the App Store didn't really exist yet. So if you're going to ask me how to start an independent game development career, I would say get a time machine, go back in time and do that. That's the only answer I can give you that I know 100% sure to be true. Since then, I've been consulting with thousands of developers. I help indie studios around the world start their career, start their game, finish their game. The most important thing I want you to understand from that story is that when I tell you something, I tell you that from a position of being that person. And so in some cases, I might say things where you're like, yeah, but you're kind of, can I curse? Yeah. All right. You're kind of full of shit. That's okay, right? Take your own course, like take what I tell you, and then do what you think is right with that, right? If I say absolutely don't do something, you do it and you're very successful, please message me, tell me you were wrong, like it's fine, I don't mind. I'm just happy that things worked out for you, okay? Cool. So there are a lot of talks about business, there's a lot of talks about creativity. I want to talk about the messy stuff in between that makes a video game. Because the most common question I get throughout all my consultancy outside of, we're out of money, is how do we pick a video game that will make money? How do we make a video game that will make money? How do we get funding? How do we get to that point of game development? I actually think that a lot of people, when they think about that, they just think about business. They think about, okay, what's the market research we can do? What's the timelines we can create? And I think that we're missing something in that discussion. Specifically, what we're doing is creative development. And that's kind of a weird combination. Creative is very unfocused. It can go in any direction. It takes time. It's not really a process that you can consistently follow when you're doing creative work. Development is very technical, right? You have a specification. You're working towards that specification. And if that specification changes, things go to hell. Now, the problem is we're trying to combine them. So we're saying, okay, we don't know where we're going, but we're going to go there. We're going to program it. And then we're going to find out what works and what doesn't work along the way, right? And so the best metaphor we have is, being strapped to the front of a train and building the railroad as the train is moving. That's game development. So what I want to do is I want to run you through how I've seen the process of creative development work best in small studios. So I'm talking teams of 1 to like 12 people. A lot of this methodology will also work on larger studios and can scale up, just multiply everything by several factors. Double your studio is not double the work, it's triple your work, right? It's more work to run more people because now you also have to manage the people. Cool. I'm going to rapid fire this a little. If anything goes too fast, I'm very sorry. I'll be around after this. I'll also be around at the Dutch Games Association booth. So like if you have questions or I went too fast, just find me there, okay? Is any of this going too fast yet? No? Okay, cool. Let's go. So, creative development is on the one side, and I think every team needs a creative director. For any project, you need somebody who's in charge of the creative. Now, very often I hear, oh, it's all of us. Please don't make it all of us. Pick one of you. And then across that person is somebody we call the producer, who is in charge of getting the game out there. So if you would think of these people, they kind of have different goals. The creative director is trying to make a good game. The producer doesn't give a shit and just wants to ship one, right? And that distinction is really important because I believe at the top of every games project should be these two people. On the one side, your creative director who pushes for quality, and on the other side, your producer who pushes for less budget, less time, and get this game out of the door, right? Unless you're really, really confident and comfortable in this role of doing both, these should be two different people. Preferably, these are not the same person, because I will tell you, I can be creative director on one project and producer on another. That works for me. But being that person, both those aspects of game development on one project, it always fucks me up. Because I'm both pushing for quality, but I'm also the one who has to hold myself back. And that level of sort of like self-reflection, self-control, constraint, it takes a lot out of you. You can do it, but it's going to exhaust you. So I recommend to separate those two people out. Even if you can do it, generally you should know better than to attempt this, unless you're okay with taking that effort on, right? For solo projects, I've seen people be successful with this. It's just really hard. Now, the game development process looks like this. You start at the start, and then you finish at the end, right? But if you think about it a little more, there's actually several processes happening next to each other, right? So programming, art, narrative design, music, sound, any of these processes happen simultaneously. And you can think of each time these arrows align as sort of like a dependency. If this is done, that needs to be done. For this to be done, that needs to be done. But then really, this isn't quite it either. This is more what game development looks like, right? Like a dependency that might come later for one team, might come earlier for another. And so game development is kind of a mess. But if we kind of use this as a metaphor, right? We can really divide any game development project into three phases. The first one is the defining phase. So this blue stuff here, that's where we figure out what we're making. We don't know yet. We have an idea. It could be cool, could not be cool, right? Then after that part, the green part, we have a period where we are affecting the game. So even though we have a good idea of what we're going to be making, we're still making changes that have impact. Near the end, we're not changing stuff anymore. We're just implementing, right? We know what we're doing, and we're implementing our game. What's important is that in this part, your biggest choices happen. The biggest choice you make on any game development project is the first one. Doesn't matter what the choice was. If you say, okay, it's side view, you've now killed about 70% of games you can make, right? Those won't be it anymore. And so these choices are the biggest choices you're going to make, and as you go, the choices become narrower and narrower. So that's why we go from defining to sort of affecting to eventually implementing. Now, if we take those two roles from before, right, the creative director and the producer, you can kind of split them this way. So at the start, in the defining phase, the creative is experimenting. They just have ideas. They'll come back to the office, or they'll come back to the team, or to your Discord or Slack, and they'll say, oh my God, I played Elden Ring last week, and everybody goes, oh God, what is this going to be, right? So we're just experimenting. The producer is trying to force your creative director to start defining things. Tell me what's true. Tell me what we're doing. What are we making, right? And so the producer is trying to put some brakes on this. Because the creative, I can tell you, they can keep ideating for years if you let them, right? So the producer is trying to put a limit onto this. Now, when we get to the affecting phase, usually the creative is still kind of catching up. They're defining, they're trying to say, okay, this is true, this might need some changes, this is true, this is true. The producer is trying to take that and figure out how to move that into production, where we're saying, okay, we've done a little loop, we've made a stage, we've made a level, we've made a fight, we've made an enemy, we've made a unit, we've made a tree, whatever we've made. We know how long that takes. We can now extrapolate how long that's going to take across the project, right? And then finally, when we are in production, the creative director is going to try and expand. They're like, oh, but we have time for one more level. We can do one more, right? It's going pretty fast. The producer is like, yeah, nah. Now, we're doing these amount of levels, and I'm probably going to cut two, right? So these forces are opposite. One is always trying to get more, and the other is always trying to limit that, right? And the truth is, if both of these people can have healthy arguments, discuss, and find a balance, an equilibrium, then you get the best game that you can possibly make within the time that you actually have available. For that, these two people need to respect each other, they need to trust each other, and they need to listen to each other even if they disagree, right? Because they will. That's kind of the point. So this is sort of the oh my God, my mouse is on the screen, I hate that. Okay. This is sort of the overall model of what we were just talking about. So at first, we're turning assumptions into definitions. That's sort of where our biggest choices happen. Then we have our choices limited by our earlier choices, so that's where we sort of narrow in the game. And then finally, we're out of choices. We're just making our thing unless shit's on fire, in which case we adjust. But we don't go backwards. We never go backwards, right? So let's talk about the structure of that. First off, the prototype. And I'm going to tell you right now, 90% of indie game projects I see that fail because of this, because they suck at prototyping. So what is prototyping? Well, there's really two things that are happening. Your creative director is trying to figure out what we're making, and the biggest question they tend to be wanting to answer is, why are we making it, and why would anybody give a shit? Right? Those are our two big questions. And so I help teams figure out these questions, because ROI is actually kind of a complicated question. I don't know if you've ever seen this one, but I teach this one. If you haven't seen this one, the effective way it works is I believe that a game can be split into three parts: the core, the mechanics, and the declarative layer. For the core, that's sort of like your nugget, your truth. What is the cool thing about this? What is interesting? You know, what is the feeling that we're trying to give people? Are we trying to make them anxious? Are we trying to make them happy? Are we trying to give them joy? Do we want them to explore? Do we want them to feel mastery? Like, what feeling? So, and it can't be, it's fun. That's a bullshit answer, right? It can't be, it's smart. Like, no, what is the feeling that the player has? If it's fun, why is it fun? What is interesting about this, right? Your mechanics is everything your computer can kind of calculate. That's the rules, that's the numbers, the variables, the way those are affected. Your declarative is how you explain those, right? So your graphics, your sound, but also sort of the way you explain your mechanics to people. And if everything's okay, these kind of like point inwards. So your declarative layer supports your mechanics, supports your core, right? If you can get this schedule, if you can just like draw this and just put little X's on it, but okay, we have this mechanic, where does this mechanic fit? Do we have this mechanic because of the core feeling? Do we have this mechanic because otherwise the art doesn't work? That's weird. Why is that arrow pointing outwards, right? So you can sit and sort of like, as an abstract, just try to figure out how your game fits on this form. And then the rules that are related to this is the creative director's job is really just to focus on the core. They protect it. This is their job. It's like a little seedling, and they want to make sure that it's okay. Around that are your designer and programmer who implement the mechanics layer, and then around that are your writer, your artist, your audio designer, those kind of things, right? And then we have their why. Why do people play video games? Well, if you want to say it really bluntly, they want us to lie to them so that they have feelings. Because high scores aren't real. These numbers are just numbers. They don't mean anything, but we told them it means something. We went at the end of the game, we went, holy shit, 32,600, you're great. You just press buttons good, right? And Morden isn't real. They're polygons, writing, and sound recordings, and Baldur's Gate doesn't exist, right? Now, we all accept this, but that's the contract we're signing, right? You buy our game, we will lie to you, and you will have feelings. That's it. So, if you break apart a game, really, you have the player in the top right, and the player has an idea of how games work. They have an idea of how the genre works. If you have a racing game, you play it on a controller, what is accelerate? Right trigger, right? You have a platforming game or a shooter, you want to jump, it's on a controller, A button or X button, or, you know, on Nintendo, B button, or A button. Nintendo's hard. On a PC, spacebar, right? We know these things to be true. We know how games are supposed to work. We know how genres are supposed to work. So the player has a mental model, and that mental model is updated every frame of your game. So every frame that they're playing, that is updated. That goes into an intent. They're like, oh my God, this is the state. I understand what's happening. I understand, here are my characters, here are my units. This is where the enemy is, or this is where I am. I have this weapon, this much ammo, or I need to water my crops, and because we understand those systems, so that model gets updated every frame, it turns into an intent, the intent is translated into an input. Input is anything the computer can measure. You know, it has you press this button, the computer goes, okay, but it can be anything. It can be a webcam, it can be online data, it can be a microphone. I saw a game where you scream at each other. Like, anything counts as input, right? As long as your computer can measure it. That goes into the game. So the input is processed by the game. Now, the game is a black box. You should try and separate out the input, the output, and the video game. The video game is just the input comes in, stuff happens, and then there's a new state of the game. This is now what the game is. And then we actually choose, out of that black box, what to communicate back to the player. That's a choice. And that choice is important. A lot of people don't think about this, but you can make the best systems you want, but the way you communicate them is really important. Think about it this way. Dark Souls boss, right? Like hard boss, difficult boss fight, right? Go to the boss, start chipping away, you start seeing the health bar disappear, you see the attacks, you read the attacks, you start to understand how the battle works. Would that fight be different if you don't communicate the health bar? Same mechanics, nothing changed. Completely different video game, right? That output goes back into the mental model. That mental model updates, the player creates a new intent, that creates a new input, that creates a new, and so on and so on. This happens 30, 60, 120 times per second, right? So this is how a game actually works. So if you go back to this model, right, this part here is your declarative. It's explaining to the player what's happening. And this part here is your mechanical. So on that side, all the mechanical stuff happens. On this side, all the declarative stuff happens. And if these two align with each other, you can make something that works in that mental model of the player. Because when you think about it, where is the game actually happening? It's in the mental model. It's not in the game. The game is just the way we deliver it to people's brains. But like I said, Baldur's Gate isn't real, but we can make people believe Baldur's Gate is real, even if just for a while. And we cheat for players all the time, right? We've had this discussion with some of you. I've had this discussion for sure, but like, nobody actually rolls a dice when you roll a dice in a video game. Nobody codes that as random 6 because that sucks. If you get like 1 25 times in a row, that's totally fair according to the code, but everybody will hate you. So we go, okay, if the total of the last 10 rolls is under 24 or something, we'll give you something nice. We'll give you a 5 or a 6 for the next one, just some bad luck protection. Why? Because it's fair. Is it true? No. Does that matter? No, because it doesn't matter. What matters is what they believe, right? The other thing I tell people is, okay, take your game and try to split it out into loops. Every 1 second, what is the player thinking? What are they busy with? What are they concerned with? So take a shooter game. On the 1 second, I'm not thinking much. Bullets are coming, I go that way. Usually that way. I don't know why I always strafe right. See enemy, pull trigger. See enemy not under crosshair, move crosshair. That's it. I don't have time for more. 1 second is pretty short, right? But on the 5 seconds, I'm thinking, okay, I'm getting hit. I need to move, right? I need to move out of the way. Or, hey, if I push a little, I can get to the enemy. On the 15-second loop, I'm actually thinking on a strategic level. I'm like, okay, I want to move to cover behind here so that I can get some health back. And then after that, I'm going to go around the left side and try and flank them, right? And I found that the interesting stuff in video games happens on the contrast points between those loops. If you go and you can tell this loop, and it's the same loop between 1 second and 15 seconds. This is for a shooter, right? If that's all the same, I want to put my crosshair on the enemy and pull the trigger. On 5 seconds, I want to put my crosshair on the enemy and pull the trigger. On 15 seconds, I want to put my crosshair on the enemy and pull the trigger. That's not an interesting game. It's flat. It doesn't have depth. So if you draw this, every game genre sort of has its own thing. For shooters, it's a little shorter loop. But for example, a farming game or a strategy game, the loop could be longer. So find where those circles are for your game and how long are those loops, because talking about where those contrast points are will reveal to you where the depth of your game is. Okay? The contrasts are kind of the glue of your video game, when you think about it. Cool. This is the MDA framework. If you've never heard of this, look up the MDA framework and then know that I disagree with it. It's not a bad framework. It helps. The basic version is that you have your mechanics and your aesthetics. The aesthetic is the feeling that we talked about, or the core. The mechanics are the mechanics. And then the MDA framework says that if you take those two, the thing that the player ends up doing because they understand the mechanics and see the aesthetics is the dynamics. So the way the player behaves is the dynamics of the mechanics and the aesthetics. That's a useful thing to know. So how you present something and the mechanical affordances your player have That's what creates what the player actually does. That's how we steer them, right? But we don't control the dynamics. We can't say, this is the dynamic that we want you to do. We have to do it by limiting the player, which is what mechanics are, right? We're limiting players. We're not giving them options. We're taking away options. A jump is not adding something. It's just saying, okay, you can't fly, right? So mechanics limit the player, and then the aesthetics is how we communicate that back to the player, right? So I'm not going to talk more about this. I'm not going to talk more about this because I like this better. Full transparency, part of why I like this better is I designed this, so that's part of it. But for me, this makes more sense as sort of like I'm going to the heart of the thing, and that's what I want with this exercise, right? But effectively, if you look at the MDA framework, wow, the colors are invisible. This is sort of a similar thing where on the left the mechanics are blue, and then the aesthetics are the core, and then the declarative is in the dynamics, right? So prototyping, how are we going to find these things, right? We're prototyping. We're trying to answer these questions. How do you do that? Well, you use the iterative process. We've all been taught the iterative process, and for some reason, we all suck at the iterative process. We suck at the iterative process because we get obsessed with things. We make a thing and we're like, oh my God, this is the best. I want to spend 6 months of my life on it. And that's a bad idea, it turns out. The iterative process, for those of you who forgot about it, because we tend to be bad at it, you define what you're trying to solve, you brainstorm, which means you're coming up with as many ideas as possible, you pick one solution that you all agree is best, you implement it, you validate whether it works. If it does work, we continue. If it doesn't work, we try again. If there are partial learnings, we take those partial learnings when we implement the next cycle, and we go around this cycle as much as possible. Now, I want to tell you, for a prototype, this cycle should be measured in days, preferably in hours, right? I see so many teams where I get to them and they're about to pitch, and I'm like, oh, your prototype is good. How long have you been working on it? And they're like 1.5 years, and I'm like, how old do you think you're going to be? How long do you think you're going to live? That's 1.5 years, and you don't know whether it works yet. I'm almost 36 at this point. I take 3 years to make a video game. I have like 15 left in me, and then we're done. I'm not going to spend 1.5 years fucking prototype. Like, come on. If it's fun after a week or two, let's try it. If it's not, fuck it. Next one. I have thousands of ideas, so do you. So make the next one. And maybe in 1 year or 2 years, you'll come back to that idea and you'll go, that's how it works. That's now I figured it out. And then you make that one. But please don't spend 6 months of your life trying to figure out whether a thing works. If it doesn't work within a few weeks, it's not going to work. Okay? So I want you to implement quick. I want this loop to be fast. I don't want people to say, okay, 2-week sprints for a prototype. No, absolutely not. Faster. If the thing you want to prototype, you need to prototype, takes weeks to prototype something smaller. You're making a strategy game. Don't build a full strategy game yet. Make things move. Is that interesting? Does it feel good? Is there something clever there? If you have a unique selling point or a unique mechanic, does it work? You can get that going in days. Instead of spending 6 months trying to get the right balance between your units and your enemies. That's not important yet. We're not there yet. We need to figure out if it's fun, if there's something interesting here. And so when you prototype, the other thing I want you to do is I want you to be reckless. Just be reckless. If your character moves at 10 units, right, per whatever, and that feels like this, I don't want you to come back and say 12, because 12 will feel like this, which feels the fucking same. If you're at 10 and you want to try if faster is better, go for 20. Is that too fast? Yeah? Okay, 15. Is that too slow? Okay, now we're getting somewhere. You could go 10, 10.5, 11, 11.5, and spend the next 20 minutes of your life figuring this out, or you just double the number. You want to make your video game better and it has action? Double the amount of enemies and half their health. 90% of the time, that makes your game better, right? So, big values, reckless choices. Don't think about this too much. The faster you can implement, the better it is, right? I wish I could move the microphone before I did that to you all. The thing we're looking for is coherence and communication. So is this coherent? Does this feel like a whole, right? When I play this, does this feel like it has a direction? And can I communicate the point of this to players? Communication, one really easy way of doing communication in this very early stage of your games is go to Steam find any game's page, hit Control-S, save the page out, and then replace the images with images of your game, and replace the text with text of your game. Just pretend you're making the Steam page. Don't make the Steam page yet. But pretend you're making the Steam page. Because the way you learn to communicate about your game, the best way to learn to communicate about your game is just to imagine how you're going to communicate it to the player in the end, right? So just fake a Steam page, fake a Kickstarter. Don't do those things yet. Way too early for that. But build them. Think about this. Does this work? Can I communicate this? Is this interesting? And the thing we're trying to get to is we're trying to get to this amorphous blob of this game could be anything, and we're trying to put stakes in it so the blob can't go anywhere. Because the blob can go anywhere. The blob can literally be any shape, right? Not the Rami game, the blob. The blob of this game, right? It can be any shape. And the thing I want you to understand is that our brains are really good at being the blob, right? Because if I tell you, okay, we have a game, and I use this example, in a castle, in the sky, in the clouds, and there's a knight fighting the dragon. You can imagine that, right? Now, obviously, the next thing would be the knight has a sword. But what if I tell you the knight has a F-16? You can make that work. Your brain will go like, yeah, okay, F-16. That's not how video games work. The computer is not, you now need to program an F-16. That's a big problem. Sword would have been easier. Our brain is really good at letting the blob do whatever it needs. As soon as you start saying, like, no, this is true, this is true, this is true, the blob has to take a shape. That's your video game. That shape becomes your video game. Okay. When we've got all that, we have the prototype, you can play it, it's interesting, it's coherent, we can talk about it, we get lock-in. Get your team together, everybody sit down, play the thing, write a small document, not a big document. Please don't write a 40-page game design document. You're not a 200-person studio. Write a short document, put all the agreements in there, have the prototype there, look at it, get everybody to agree on it. Artist, what's the art style we're imagining? I don't want words, I want drawings. I want art. I want concept art. I want a fake screenshot. I want a mock-up. So that we can all look at it and be like, oh yeah, that's what we thought. And I want the prototype to be playable. And I want the designer to sit with the prototype and say, okay, this is what's interesting, this is what's interesting, this is what we're going to focus on. We get lock-in. Make sure this is all captured. The fake screenshots, the mock-ups, the document, the prototype, capture this somewhere. Get everybody to look at it, get everybody to say, yep, and then put it in a document, everybody said yep. Okay? Because later on, people are going to disagree that they said yep. Because we're creatives, we want more. But setting these limits and saying, okay, this is true, helps. The producer, in the meanwhile, is crying. Because this part of the process is completely unpredictable. We don't know how long it takes, we don't know how long the iterations are, we don't know how many iterations we need. So the producer is just trying to sort of like look at how to limit this. If you want a tip as a producer in this segment, you have to allow space for experimentation. But you don't have to allow infinite space for experimentation. So what you're going to do is you're going to try and keep the cycle short. Every iterative cycle cannot take 2 weeks. It can take 2 days. It can take 3 days. It can take a week. And then the only thing you're going to look for is momentum. So if in 1 week we can get 90% of the way there, then obviously in the second week we're not going to get 90% more of the way there, right? That's not how that's going to work. There's no 90% left. We can get 90% of the remainder there, right? If that curve starts to die down or even go backwards, put a limit on it. Just say, okay, listen, I'm going to give you 2 more weeks, and after that I need to know whether this works or not, and otherwise we're moving on. Look for momentum. Don't look for absolutes, look for relative. Compared to last week, is this good progress? Do we feel closer? Is this a significant difference? And if that stays the same, we're always 90% closer, then you're never going to get there. Right? You either have to make a call or you have to move on, one or the other. That's up to the creative director. That's not your job. Your job is to tell them they're out of time. And this is also where you start talking to publishers. Now, you don't have to show, you don't have to pitch yet, but this is where you have something playable, you have mock-ups, you can talk about the game, you figured out how to describe it on a Steam page. You didn't publish the Steam page, but you figured out how to talk about it. You can now start talking. So if you go to an event and you meet a publisher, start talking about your game, maybe show the prototype. It doesn't have to be perfect yet. You're not going to pitch it to them. You're just going to say, like, hey, I'm working on this thing. It might be interesting. Take a look at it, right? And then if they say, hey, this could be interesting, let's talk about it when you're a bit further, then do that, okay? For the second part, we do the vertical slice. And I think the vertical slice is the second part where most development processes go wrong. Because vertical slices are very often understood as we have to build one part of the game, And people think that it's a creative exercise. It's not. It's a production exercise. We're trying to figure out how long it takes to build a level, build a unit, build a thing. And so for this, the most important thing is that you figure out how to separate out features and content. Ooh, 6 minutes. Features and content. So real quick, features are verbs. They're things you do, jump, die, walk, shoot, anything of those. Content is level, world, character, weapons. They're nouns, right? So features are verbs, contents are nouns. This is going to be important because as producer, you're going to want to separate these out and you want to focus on the features. They're the structural parts of the game, but you need enough nouns to be able to test these features, right? So we're starting to test our pipelines here. If we want to make a level, who gets stuck? Where do they get stuck? Is somebody waiting for somebody? Why was that not done yet? Could that be done? If not, why are they already doing this when we don't have the thing that we need yet, right? The producer's trying to figure out what is fucking up. And the reason we have to do this is because every game is completely different, right? It's very rare that you look at a game and you're like, this process worked on the previous one, let's do the exact same thing. It doesn't work that way, right? We're doing weird custom software pretty much every time. Unless you're doing like straight up derivative. You made a match 3 game, it was about pandas last week and it's about cats this week. Okay, you can probably do something like that. But otherwise, like every game is just a completely new problem, right? So you want to separate these things out. And then for the second part, as you're building this, the creative director is trying to look for their pillars, their USPs, and their alignment. These words sound really big, but the main thing you want to remember is pillars is sort of internally how you think about what makes the game interesting. This is true. These are the core truths of the game. The USPs are the thing we're going to present to our audience as the unique things about our game. They don't have to be the same. When we did Ridiculous Fishing back in the game, one of the pillars was that it was an infinite positive feedback loop. You could take your phone and just kind of like slap it against your face. Sorry. Slap it against your face. And you would still win. You could not lose Ridiculous Fishing. It always felt good. You always got more stuff, right? We're not going to tell that to the player. We're not going to go, hey, it doesn't matter whether you're good or not. Of course not. Our unique selling point is this is a game about fishing with chainsaws. That's sold fairly well. So these can be separate, internal, external. And alignment just means that your team agrees. Again, during the vertical slice process, we're learning a lot about the production methodology. How are we going to approach this problem? But we're also learning a bit about the game. And so for the creative director, it's important that everybody stays aligned, that we keep that core, we keep that vision with us. So the pillars and anti-pillars are internal. If you haven't heard the word anti-pillars, it's just the same as pillars, but the opposite way. So this is what the game is not. Very often when you're making a shooter, people go like, oh, okay, so guns. And you're like, no, not guns. It's like, oh, okay, that's not what I expected guns. It's like, no, not guns. It's X, Y, Z, right? So anti-pillars are sort of like expectations that you're defying. Pillars are just the things that are true about the game. Your USPs are external. And in the meanwhile, the producer is trying to validate the production process. So features, as we go, become harder to cut. They're hard to scale. Content is easier to cut and easy to scale. So if I take jump out of the video game, all my level design is now invalid, right? But if I take a level out of the game, everything else still works, right? So as producer, trying to figure out how you balance these things out becomes sort of a big part of your job right now. And then one thing I tend to do with games is I try to create the walking skeleton as if I produce the game, which means I'm trying to figure out what the absolute basic features are I need to actually test whether this works. And when you think about it, a lot of this makes a lot of sense. If you have weapons and I need to make a gun, a melee, a shotgun, and a bazooka, then a melee is a short-range gun, a shotgun is many bullets out of gun, and a bazooka is a gun that hits multiple things when it hits. That's it. It's a slow bullet, right? So if I can just get to the thing that gets me the most bang for my buck, that's what I want to do first, right? And then as we go, we start adding things that are important to the game to get to something like a minimum shippable product. At the same time, the producer also has to figure out the hierarchy and the structure of the project. I use something called a RACI chart. That's R-A-C-I. I'm not going to tell you all about it because the host is going to murder me. But what I can tell you is that for every task versus every job, every person on your team, you want to figure out who has the A. So RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consultant, Informed. Accountable means you are the one responsible for this thing happening, but you're not necessarily the one who's implementing it. So an art director would be A for art, but they're not the person necessarily implementing the art. Knowing this, make sure that everybody on your team knows who to talk to and also who to blame when shit goes to hell. Both of those are important. If you do that, you're automatically setting up lines and methods of communication. So talk to the A's. That's it. Who's the A? That's the person. They have the answer. And then remember that both as producer and a creative director, your most valuable resource is trust, which means you have to be accountable, you have to set clarity of goals and clarity of constraints. I'm going to stress this for 12 seconds. Clarity of goals, that's the creative director's job. This is where we're going. This is our North Star. This is our beacon. They keep everybody pointing in the same way. The producer is setting the constraints. You have 2 weeks, you have 1 week. You know what's frustrating? Somebody telling you, hey, we need this, you working on it for 2 weeks, then delivering it, and them going like, we wanted you to have it in 3 days. Well, then fucking tell me, right? If you balance these things out so that people have clear constraints and clear goals, they can do good work. If you let either of these slip, they get frustrated. You make a chair, I make a chair, wrong chair. Why wrong chair? Why did I spend the day making chair and it's bad? Why is it bad? Why did I not know it was going to be bad, right? That's more than 12 seconds. Ironically, we're going to talk about timelines. So, 1 minute. These are your main timeline points. Your vertical slice, your feature complete, your content complete, your release candidate. Main thing I want to talk about is, since we're going for vertical slice, when you think about this and you're talking to publisher, the main thing they will care about is your ratios, which means you have your pre-production, which is your sort of like prototyping, and then your vertical slice, then after you have your production. Split that into feature complete, when is the game working, and content complete, when is all the stuff in. These ratios have to make sense. So these are different games. If you do a experimental roguelike, the blue one is the experimental roguelike. You're spending a lot of time in pre-production, right? If you're making a clone of a deck builder, the third one, right? Very short pre-production, a lot more content work. If this doesn't make sense, every publisher is going to look at your shit and go like, nah. So don't do that. I'm going to skip all this shit. When it comes to production methodology, none of this is science, right? There's a million methods you can do that I just skipped through. All you have to understand is whatever comes out of this is not science, all right? This helps. But if you disagree what comes out of that, that's okay. Nope. Yes. As you're trying to get here, as you're trying to get this done, right, and you're trying to build all these processes, you don't have to get it right on the first try. Vertical slice doesn't mean you get to make one level. Please make one, see what works. If you don't feel confident yet, do it again, right? And then when you feel confident about your production methodology, lock that in. Cool. This is where publisher actually want to talk about your game, okay? So if you have that vertical slice, you can show a level, you have your mock-ups, you have your goals, you know how production is going to take, you have your timelines, you can figure out your budget with your timeline because it's just the amount of money you're spending per month over the amount of months, right? So now you can figure out everything. This is where you pitch. I'm going to skip that. 2 things, real quick. Two things real quick. When you are in the early stages, your creative director is usually trying to sort of like get into the details of how things are going to work. When you move to production, stop doing that. Creative director, zoom all the way out. Keep track of the full project. Is it still moving in the right direction? If something goes wrong, zoom back in, find what's going wrong, fix that. If the chair is wrong, don't go to the artist and tell them the chair is wrong. Figure out why the fuck the artist made the wrong chair. Why is that chair not right? What about the art direction isn't working? For the producer, do it the other way around. Producer's keeping bird's eye view for most of it. When you're working in the project, look for what small thing is late. Why is it late? What is wrong? What does this mean as sort of a knock-on effect for the rest of the project? And the other thing, if you're making a video game, for the love of God, this is going to be the last thing I have. Stop making perfect video games. People try to make video games that are 100% good 100% of the time. What I'm going to tell you is very simple. 70% of your game should be good enough. Not great, not perfect, good enough. 25% of your game should be good. 5% of your game should be exceptional. Because if you make the entire game exceptional, everything feels baseline. Nothing stands out, nothing is better, nothing is memorable. Chrono Trigger, that's not a good game 70% of the time. You're walking through a fucking forest. You're beating up slimes. Oh, yeah. That's not a great game, right? The boss fights are. Thank you.
108 slides, people. Just wondering, how did you think you were going to do 108 slides?
They're talking faster.
You were at Act 2 and you had the Act 3.
Well, to be fair, the Act 3 is the epilogue. It's kind of like Lord of the Rings, though. Because
okay,
the
okay.
epilogue, there's like 7 epilogues. So I can cut them if I need to.
Okay, yeah, well,
Yeah.
you did.
I did.
Thank you. Give him a warm applause.